kind of growth that people had come to expect would take place. Our research had revealed that this was simply because the government made bad policy choices at critical junctures. That was what led to the idea that government needed to be able to call upon research capacity and advice outside of government, outside of the public bureaucracy.
Where CAPRI comes in is in bridging that gap. CAPRI is an organization that looks at important questions that affect our society, our economy, our development, and seeks to answer those questions by finding relevant information that are not biased or tainted by politics or special interests. Facts that are needed to make realistic decisions about problems that affect our country.
It's very important that CAPRI maintains its independence from the government, from all political parties, from private sector and other special interest groups, because it's critical that when CAPRI arrives at a policy recommendation based upon its research, there is no question as to the independence of that, so that its work can be accepted and can lead to effective implementation. CAPRI is really not in and of itself an implementing agency, but its concern is about effective implementation. And so to get that implementation done, it liaises with all concerned stakeholders. The government is obviously a very critical stakeholder.
We ensure that the research we produce does not collect dust on the shelf, but reaches the right ears. This is how, over the past 10 years, we are able to influence policies in areas such as debt, informal investment scheme, social support, and the mandate for NHD.
The new generation of Jamaicans must take responsibility for things they had no say in, things they did not cause. But we must take responsibility for the same in order to shape a future. We are a few good decisions away from the Jamaica that we want. Join us as we take responsibility for the future of our country.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Leanne Levas, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of our report today. Who am I? The People Dem NIDS. It's the general consensus that the digitization of government records is a necessary and perhaps one of the most important steps in ensuring that all Jamaican citizens, regardless of their means, are able to access essential services without risk of loss to productivity. As a result, the move towards digitization is and has been a priority for recent political administrations. As you'll hear from our speakers today, the National Identification System provides a unique opportunity to improve upon the current function-specific identification systems by providing a cost-effective, multi-purpose foundation identification system that poses minimal risk of exploitation to citizens, thereby removing what has been one of the more substantive roadblocks to advancing Jamaica as a digital society. I'm genuinely excited about the program we've put together. As an organization that's dedicated to facilitating the development of evidence-based policy, it's really important for us to have speakers and presenters who are leaders in the field, and I think we've done just that. Today's keynote presenter, for example, is Monique Graham, our lead researcher for the report, who will provide insight as to the benefits of NIDS. In addition to that, we will further explore NIDS and its national implications in the form of a panel discussion. This will be led by our Executive Director, Dr. Damian King, and include, alongside Monique, a number of distinguished experts, including Mr. Roger Malcolm, Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice, Dr. Javier Preciosi, an international independent ITC consultant who specializes in identity management systems and biometrics, as well as Mr. Chukwuemeka Cameron, privacy practitioner at Design Privacy. Before we kick things off, I'd like to extend our special thanks to IDB, who was integral to the completion of this report, and more specifically to the General Manager of the Caribbean Group at IDB, Mrs. Therese Turner-Jones, who has kindly offered to provide some opening remarks. Before handing off to her, I just want to say welcome again. Thank you for coming and attending the launch of our NIDS report, and we hope that you find this event to be one that is both engaging and informative. I'll hand over to Mrs. Therese Turner-Jones now.
Thank you, Leanne. A very exciting launch today, and the IDB is exceptionally pleased to be supporting the implementation of the National Identification System in Jamaica. As you all know, this is exactly the kind of innovative project that we like to support, and we think it's really important. But obviously, all innovative projects have risks, and this one has been no exception, right? So if we go back to the Supreme Court decision, we've done quite a bit of introspection and reflection on how we could have communicated the benefits of the National Identification System better, and consulted with more stakeholders, and I think we've done that. And today, with the partnership with CAPRI, which started last summer, we're really pleased that the research has happened. The study is very well done, and they've looked at some interesting aspects of this. And let me also say, in the course of doing the introspection, any national identification system obviously hinges on some important concepts. And the first one has to be data security, privacy, and of course, having the right information at hand, and also information that every single Jamaican can understand. It's not just for technocrats to understand it, it's not just for the IT personnel to understand it, but every single Jamaican needs to understand what is involved in this. It's the only way we're going to build partnership. It's the only way we're going to build buy-in. And I think what you're going to hear today in the discussion is going to take us a long way in achieving that. You know, the debate around privacy and data in an era of technology is one that is already at the center of many policy and legal issues. And we feel that it's likely to remain that way for many years to come, for obvious reasons. We're all concerned about it. We recognize that having a broad and diverse set of stakeholders provide their views is critical, and hence this launch, and we're hoping to get many more views from you today. As a development institution, we're just starting to scratch the surface of what we can do in this area. We certainly see a significant role for the IDB and other institutions like us, helping countries navigate the complex set of issues related to the intersection of technology, data protection, and transparency. From this perspective, the NIDS has been an eye-opener for us and a project that will define how we work in this area in the future, not just in Jamaica, but all over the region. From that perspective, we've taken the Supreme Court decision in the NIDS case as an opportunity, and we believe that the new NIDS that will emerge after that decision will be a much stronger one. Case in point, the decision gave impetus for the approval of the Data Protection Act, which I think everybody in this country appreciates, and which now stands as a key protection for all Jamaicans in this area. We've also learned from this experience more about how citizens feel about their governments on critical matters such as this, which need to be handled with a great degree of sensitivity. I've read multiple times in the media the paradox that many Jamaicans are willing to open their data, for example, to the US government to obtain a visa, but would refrain from doing the same with their own government. Gaining the trust of citizens should be a high priority for governments everywhere in the digital era. This can be a very challenging task, as we know. At the bank, we're also exploring this from a broader perspective. For example, by also supporting projects that foster transparency and accountability in government. Having said all this, we should remember what the purpose of the National Identification System is. And I want to close with that. NIDS, as we see it, is a gateway to a digital society. I like to call it the key to a digital society. People know that I've been a very enthusiastic promoter of Estonia and its digital government model. We've actually studied that extensively, and we've taken all 6 countries in the Caribbean that I represent to Estonia to learn firsthand for what Estonia has done and how it can offer lessons for us. Of course, there's room for improvement everywhere, and Estonia is a society that made it possible for citizens to conduct virtually all of their business with the government online, including voting. This is the one that I really like. The gain in terms of productivity and quality of life for citizens is immense. This model is based on a strong, secure, national ID, digital ID, as a cornerstone of this system, alongside with strong connectivity, cybersecurity, and of course, data protection. I have a vision for the Caribbean moving in this same direction. I firmly believe it's possible, and this is why we as a development bank are willing to support challenging projects, especially if they help our partner governments achieve that vision. I think everyone would agree, given that we are now 8 months into living with a pandemic and working from home for many people, like every single employee of the IDB right now, that this is exactly the moment to be pushing the pedal on adopting a digital identity and doing more on a digital platform. Jamaica, as always, has been an early mover for us. And we have projects, similar projects happening in the Bahamas, in Barbados, and also in Trinidad and Tobago, working in the same direction, hoping to establish a strong digital ID. Identifying and managing risk is a critical part of any innovative technology project, and this one is no exception. CAPRI's research has pointed out the gaps and challenges that a national identification system can address in providing service to citizens. After the first attempt, the key stakeholders are fully aware of the risks, and that's what we're hoping to do today, and I'm glad you're here to be part of this discussion. We look forward to exploring how the national identification system can be implemented with minimal risks and maximum benefits for the citizens of Jamaica. Thank you very much.
Therese, and not only for those remarks, but also thank you to the IDB for their support for this exercise from the very beginning. The IDB recognized the importance of transitioning to a digital society, especially for small societies. And so they have been an enthusiastic supporter of this research at CAPRI. We are here to talk about NIDS, not NIDS. That is to say, we're here to talk about a generic universal national identity system and the importance of that. We are not using the term NIDS to mean the particular form of that system that was first proposed by the government of Jamaica. We want to talk about the implications of a universal identification system and what are the challenges, what are the issues, what are the benefits. I'll be moderating this discussion, and I cannot tell you how excited I am to be at this point, not only because of the importance of this particular research project and its implications, but also for the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, after more than 6 months into lockdown and quarantine and isolation, to be once again engaging the public on an important national issue. We are going to be using, for our question and answer and for your interaction with the discussion, a platform called Slido. There are 3 ways that you can get onto this platform. You will be able to access it through a QR code, which is going to be on your screen at some point. There it is now. Secondly, you can download the Slido app from Google Play or the iPhone App Store and install it. And finally, you can simply browse to sli.do, and it will ask you for an event code, and you put in CAPRI. Once you have access to the Q&A platform, to Slido, then you can post your questions, and those questions will be seen by me, the moderator, that I can pass on to the researcher and the panelists. But also, you can view questions that have been posted by other people and vote them up if you think those questions are particularly important for an answer to be provided. And so we are going to be selecting using the popularity of a question to determine if it should be passed on to the discussants. The main event of this launch and this forum is CAPRI's research on the importance and the implications of a national identity system. The lead researcher and the presenter of this research to you is Monique Graham, economist and researcher at CAPRI. I now hand over to Monique to tell you what we have found by investigating NIDS.
Who am I? Few people in the town of Exton, St. Elizabeth can dispute 55-year-old Joseph Brown's statements. In his craft, behind his one-bedroom wooden structure, Joe has never worked for but endearing him to loyal clients. Joe has always been very but the pandemic was clients lost their regular incomes. Joe seems to have a friend of hope, but there's a problem. Joe doesn't have any identification. Joe doesn't even have a birth certificate. So he travels to the Registrar General's department all the way in Santa Cruz, where they have to do a search in the system to see if any registration information for him. Joe is for the RG. He's for the RG office that he needs something called a certified affidavit. So his neighbor helps him to write down what he knows about his birth circumstances. And you know, he needs a justice of the peace to certify it. That same neighbor recommends one just about 2 miles from the community. Joe gets his affidavit. Joe gets his affidavit certified on his second trip to the JP's office. He secures his birth certificate after another trip to the Registrar General's department. And you know, Joe needs to apply for a passport. The passport office doesn't know Joe. So, after filling out the application form, taking a photo, traveling to the same JP to have it certified, Joe got his passport. You know, feel it for Joe? He can now apply for the compassionate grant, finally. Stopping by the internet cafe in Junction, where most of his community members are applying for the grant, someone offers to help him. Name, Joseph Brown. Address, Exton Junction, PO. Tax registration number, The tax administration doesn't know Joe. Disappointment, frustration, and defeat only express a few of the emotions Joe was feeling. Think about the almost 200,000 Jamaicans needing to go through this process just to access basic and entitlements. They are some of the poorest and most marginalized members of our society. Now, although the RGD, which is Jamaica's sole repository for vital life events, does a great job with birth registration, when it comes to those who are most vulnerable, for example, persons with disabilities, there is very low coverage. In 2015, 85% of the persons registered at the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities do not have a birth certificate. When we look at the coverage for the actual identifications, we realize that it is also relatively low. Approximately 25% of the adult population have a valid driver's license. 43% have a valid electoral ID, and 56% have a valid passport. But why are so many persons in Joe's predicament? One of the reasons is that there are logistic and bureaucratic barriers to accessing these means of identification. Let us take, for example, the electoral ID, Jamaica's de facto national identification. By law, any individual without an address or who is mentally incapacitated is excluded from accessing this identification. Also, it may take up to 6 months to issue this ID, as it is dependent on the date the applicant's name is registered on the voters list. And this publication only occurs twice a year, in May and November. There are also direct costs to accessing these IDs. The driver's license, for example, can cost at least 10,440 Jamaican dollars. And this is disaggregated by the cost of the provisional license, the driving test, and the actual driver's license. The passport as well. New passport applicants like Joe, it costs $6,500 to obtain this identification. Now, outside of those costs, there's the indirect cost of accessing a Justice of the Peace certification. Within the past 12 months, 25% of the adult population required JP services, and 5% of these persons were unable to access a JP. Now, although justices of the peace don't charge for their services, accessing a JP takes time and transportation costs. On average, it costs $1,850 in lost productivity to access or obtain a JP's certification. These can be heavy costs, especially for persons on low incomes. There's also the age barrier, or youths under the age of 17 are underserved by the current means of identification. A passport is the only ID that they can obtain, and with the cost attached, it is unlikely that they will have one. With no identification, these youths, especially those who are at risk of becoming unattached, cannot access training programs and other initiatives that targeted at them to keep them productive. These costs and constraints, they can be averted. We need a national identification system. Now, this identification system, it is certainly not a panacea, but rather the first step in overcoming the barrier of not having an identification. This national identification system will identify and authenticate citizens and residents in a reliably and secure way. What are the requirements for this system? The system will require your current first name, current last name, and the date of birth. And yes, biometrics will be an important feature of the system because of the irrefutable link it gives to the individual. The biometric requirements would be fingerprint of all 10 fingers and facial image. And to protect your rights as citizens, this identification system should be built on citizens to know when their data is being accessed, who has access to that, how, and what extent data is being communicated to us. More importantly, it emphasizes the need for citizens' consent, unless otherwise stated by law. When citizens know that they have control over their information, they are more inclined to trust in the system. To further engender this trust, an independent body that is responsible for overseeing the operations of the authority should also be implemented. And this body will also hold accountable the authority for enabling and protecting the rights of citizens. Now, by adopting this ID, there are benefits to be gained. Yes, benefits to you. Firstly, this system will address the lack of interconnectedness among the existing identity systems, which has facilitated the forging of identities. On average, 101 birth certificates, fraudulent birth certificates, have been recovered at IGD offices. 29 tax registration numbers at the tax admin offices, and 231 passports at PICO. And this is between 2014 and 2018 annually. With this national identification system, the unique national identification number that is generated will provide the link between the existing systems. This will increase the accuracy of information stored in the system and also makes it difficult for persons to assume different identities. Citizens are also set to benefit from the acceleration in digital transformation in Jamaica. And this comes through access to electronic government services. On average, Jamaicans spend 4.1 hours to engage in a single transaction, a single government transaction. Now, although this average is below the Caribbean's average of 4.3 hours, when we compare Jamaica's average to that of Estonia, we see that there is much room for improvement. Adding to this potential time saving is the fact that almost half of government transactions in Jamaica require 3 or more interactions just to be completed. That is at least 12.3 hours lost in productivity, in potential productivity. Think about that time saving that you might have. Persons can also benefit from becoming financially included. 1 in 5 persons are unbanked, meaning that they are unable to access services and products that are aimed at increasing their financial resilience. 13% of these persons state that it is because they do not have any form of identification. Because they're unbanked, it is more expensive, more costly for them to interact with the formal banking system. For example, on average, it costs $318 to encash a check. Now, some of the persons encashing checks are from low income and low middle income households, and they earn minimum wage. Now, $318 is almost twice the hourly minimum wage of $175. This is a heavy cost to those households. Also disadvantaged are the more than 150,000 applicants of the compassionate grant who did not benefit from it. They met all the requirements, but because of the logistical and health challenges that needed to be resolved to make the collection in-person process congruent with social distancing protocols, they were not able to benefit from this. Having this identification not only provides proof of identity, but it can also be used by banks to meet the Know Your Customer requirements. Another barrier, as a national identification system is the basis for customer identification and verification. Having this ID leveraged to meet the Know Your Customer requirements, it eases or it increases the convenience with which citizens can engage in the formal banking system or even access intermediate financial products such as mobile money or payment cards. Now, an example of this leverage is in India. The Indian biometric ADR system has been leveraged to meet electronic Know Your Customer verification. With this, they were able to enroll more than 1.2 billion persons into the formal banking system, as well as to provide access to intermediate services. Now, the benefits to be gained from a national identification system, they are numerous. And by emphasizing data protection and security, this can be realized by each citizen. The greatest benefit, however, especially for someone like Joe, is to be able to prove your identity without much effort or cost. Who am I? The People Dem NIDS.
Highlights of what are some of the challenges and many of the benefits to be had if the country were to adopt a universal or near universal digital identification system. One of the key takeaways for me listening to that is that a lot of the discussion up to this point on NIDS has had to do with the benefits to the economy, the benefits to the government, the benefits to some business sectors. And we have now gotten an appreciation, I think, of the way in which such an identity system is going to benefit the ordinary citizen. And in fact, we have even more benefit, we have particular benefit to all of those. According to the presentation, some 1 in 10 of the adult population who are marginalized or under threat of being marginalized. There are many issues for us to go through here and to unpack. So I'm going to introduce our panel for that discussion. We have with us Mr. Roger Malcolm. He's the Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice, and he specializes in human rights issues. We have Dr. Javier Preziosi. He's an ICT consultant, and he specializes in identity management systems. And of course, we have our presenter, Monique Graham, a researcher at CAPRI, and she specializes in economic analysis. I'm going to ask Roger and Javier to give us a quick response to the presentation and the issue in general. And then we're going to open the discussion to questions. Roger, can we start with you?
Okay, thank you, Damien, and thank you, Monique, for that presentation. So I want to start first by explaining that we can think about a national ID project as a what and as a how. And so the what is that we want something that everybody can access, that's fairly secure, and that is verifiable proof of legal identity. That what is most of what we heard from Monique, that's generally a beneficial activity to embark upon. The how is really what the debate is about. There's very few people that don't believe that we should have an ID that you don't need to have for a function like driving or voting or going abroad for the passport, that you can just have because you're a person. And so, however, the how, how intrusive it may end up being, any unintended effects such as social exclusion from non-participation, data protection concerns, privacy concerns, all of the how is where the divide starts. And with NIDS, when the Supreme Court struck it down, it wasn't the what, it was the how. And so I want to just talk a little bit about the how. So one of the traps that we fall into when we don't speak about the how is that we just discuss how terrible things are with these single forms of ID, and the post like Joe's sort of allow us to gloss over getting into the details, and then it justifies whatever is being requested. Moreover, it gives the impression sometimes when we don't speak about the how, that the reason that we have general inefficiencies and people unbanked and government services not reaching persons is because we don't have a sort of digital biometric NIDS type ID, as opposed to really it's because we don't have universal legal identity, which is a conflation that I want us to guard against. There's a distinction between access to legal identity as a human right, the state being able to recognize you, and the particular form of identification that is being proposed, which is controversial. So the lack of having a biometric digital ID is, not really why we have government inefficiencies or why people are generally unbanked. It's a general culture of not having a general ID. And so what we need to determine when we look at the bill is where do we strike the balance of a form of an ID that suits our interests, that is rights respecting, and that we can have a consensus vision around. Additionally, as it relates to privacy and security, I know we'll get into this some more, the Data Protection Act is being spoken about, and it's a very important safeguard. I want to make 2 points here. One, even though we've passed the Data Protection Act in 2020, it actually is not in force. And so the government has not brought that act into force as yet, for reasons known to the government only. But one of the things that members who are involved in this work have been saying and have started to say is that we really should not be contemplating passing a NIDS bill until the Data Protection Act is operationalized. And this is not for additional delay, it's for very important reasons. So the first is that without the Data Protection Act in force, we won't have any information commissioner, no regulations actually govern how data controllers should work. The Data Protection Act simply articulates standards, and we won't have a context of data protection culture and practices within which to evaluate and understand NIDS. And we may even have both of these laws being implemented simultaneously. It's really important that because NIDS may collect unprecedented amounts of data, that it's in our best interest to have an operational data protection infrastructure in place prior to any type of consideration in Parliament and passage of NIDS. But additionally, there are a few other important safeguards, and I'll just go through a few of them and pause for us to go into the panel discussion. So there are a few deployment risks that we don't really talk about when we end up just speaking only about the what. So depending on how NIDS is deployed, for example, if it's deployed in a way where it is the only means that persons can use to navigate the engagement with the state, for example, it's not simply to know who you are, but it's the only way you can access any and all services, as has been proposed in some spaces, and is in more extreme circumstances for those like in Estonia. Depending on that, the risks are quite high for social exclusion, but the risks are also quite high for those who are concerned about centralized tracking, profiling of persons based on their life patterns and their habits, and the general aggregation of data on a population based on their life patterns and habits in a way that is unnecessary for the service that they're seeking. So a few things you can do to solve this. You can separate identification from authentication when you configure the system. Hopefully we'll get speaking a little bit more about the hows involved in this. You can prevent the ability of the government to create transactional logs of how people have utilized their identification. You can prevent private sector entities and government from harmonizing their transactional data when you're using the ID card. But these are the types of hows that actually make us determine whether the benefits are worth the risks. And without discussing those hows, it's very difficult to say that we are truly evaluating the risks versus the rewards, because all the risks come in the hows. And the final thing I'll say here before I pause is that a good point was made about oversight. One of the very important architectures for what should be the authority, which is the National Identification and Registration Authority, which is the body that will administer NIDS, is that we believe quite firmly it should be an independent body like a Commission of Parliament, not part of the regular executive branch that can take instructions from political directorates, but also in a situation where the political directorate may configure the use of the national identification system to serve objectives that may be concerning for persons. And so we think, just like how the Information Commissioner, the Data Protection Act, is an independent body, not accountable to the executive branch, but accountable largely to Parliament and its statute, a similar configuration would need to be adopted. I can speak for a very long time about more and more hows, but it is in that space of figuring out how much is too much, how much is too risky, what are the unintended consequences, that will really be able to evaluate NIDS. And I would say that the principle that we should use to evaluate NIDS are A, that it is minimally intrusive, B, that it is truly voluntary, both in law and in practice, and the failure to non-enroll should not make your life a complete living hell if you have that philosophy, even if I don't hold it or you don't hold it. And third, that the results should actually lead to greater social inclusion. And if they produce any form of exclusion, NIDS has become an end and no longer a means to that end. And I'll pause there. Thank you for starting this discussion in the public space once more.
Now to our panelist, Javier Preziosi, to give us his thoughts.
Thank you.
Javier.
Thank you, Damian. First of all, I want to congratulate all the team for this work. As far as I know, it is one of the most detailed, or the most detailed and up-to-date report about identity management in Jamaica. I will not go through it was already, I think it's very clear the needs of a national ID. So I will skip my comments on that specific point. I just want to mention one thing. I think it's very important. Within our society, an identity must include all the attributes that enables that individual to be identified within that society. So it's just rhetoric to say that we already have an identity because we're born with such intrinsic attributes. If the society or the place where we live requires additional information to accept our identity, then this claim is void of content. So in this case, this not only applies for the government, but also for the transaction with private sector or any third parties. So there is a number of elements that are required to prove identity, and that goes far beyond the individual claim. So I can say I am Javier Preziosi, and that may work in some places and for some transactions, but it's clear that this does not work for a lot of other transactions. And there is another, and also a very related and important point to this, and is that an identity has to be issued in a way that cannot be challenged, and that nobody can say you are not that person. And this is very important. And this is one of the, in my opinion, this is one of the things that a government and a state has to provide. So it has to provide a valid ID, a valid identity that can be used for anything in the country and that cannot be challenged. So this is one of the points that I wanted to remark. And I clearly believe, obviously, that an ID, in fact, empowers individuals. A national ID empowers an individual. There is also, in the report, there was also a mention about how that system has to be implemented. And I agree with Roger that this is a very important discussion. In particular, there is a concept of proportionality, a principle of proportionality on what information we need to build an identity. And my opinion is that we need very few information. But I do believe that we need biometrics to have a proper and a valid how can I say, a unique ID. And in fact, I also believe that if we consider a national ID with very few and well-defined biometrics and very little biographic data, that kind of database or that kind of system is much less invasive than other systems that require a lot of information from the citizen. So for example, if to prove my identity, instead of giving my biometrics, by the way, you already have them because you have my picture and you can use it everywhere. But instead of having my biometrics, you ask me for my credit card information, the bank history, a GPay certificate, telephone number, utility bill to prove address. So if you ask all that amount of information to build my identity, then what is the information that is more private for a person? Biometrics, I think at some point we have a confusion about the biometrics, which is clearly an intrinsic attribute from a person, and the representation of those biometrics. I have my face all around the world, and that is in fact not an issue. And the problem is how to use that information. And I believe, I also agree with Roger that the use of the biometric has to be clearly defined in the context of a national ID system. It was clearly said that there are basically two steps in the identity life cycle where you can use biometrics. One is to do the enrollment and to be sure that you are giving an identity, not duplicating an identity. That is the first use of biometrics. And then there is the use of biometrics to verify that identity in the transactions that you have during your lifetime. That second biometric is not really needed. I mean, there are other ways to prove your identity. You can have a PIN associated to your ID. You can have different ways to prove your identity without going directly to biometrics. So, but in my opinion, that is obviously my opinion, biometric is really needed to guarantee the uniqueness of the identity database and of the identities issued by the system. So these are basically my first thoughts about that. So I come back to you, Damien.
Thank you very much, Javier. Okay, the people who are watching this presentation have raised a number of questions, and I want to start by putting some of those questions to the panelists. I'm going to ask the panelists, because I want to get through as many of these questions as we can, so I'm going to ask the panelists to please make their responses brief, if you keep them to about a minute. And the first one, I want to direct back to Javier, and it is the observation that if NIDS is so important as a gateway to a digital society, consider that the United States is already a highly digitized society. They don't have one. The UK tried to introduce one, and after a few years, they scrapped it. So if it is so important, why doesn't the United States and the UK have a national identification systems? Javier.
Yes. Well, first of all, I don't think the United States is the most fair country in the world for a lot of people. So I don't think it's a good example of how they manage their citizens. That's my crude opinion. In the case of the UK, and obviously there are a lot of reasons why they don't have a national ID. First of all, they have a federated state, which is very strong. So the way they manage identity is very restricted to that. In the case of the UK, there is a UK Gov UK Verify initiative, and I can say that it has a lot of it has a lot of issues. And one of those issues is the one that I mentioned before. In order to obtain an identity, you have to give to third parties which are not the government, because these are companies that in fact are obviously they are approved and regulated by the government, but these are private companies that do the verification, the clearance of your data in order to give you an identity. And at the end, if you need a very high level of assurance in the UK, you have to bring biometric documents. You have to bring your passport and your driver license or something else. If you don't bring that, you don't obtain your Gov UK verified identity. So maybe it's true that the society are more. That these countries have a digital society in place, but I'm not sure these are. I will say reach all the population. And in fact, I know, because there are a lot of reports in particular about the Gov UK Verify, that a portion of the population is not reached by this initiative.
Thank you, Javier. We have a lot of identification systems that already exist. Some of them were mentioned in the presentation, passports, driver's license, electoral IDs. One issue that has been raised, Monique, and I wonder if you could, I guess in a way, this will summarize a part of your presentation for the audience, but it has been raised in the Q&A, and it is, what are the benefits from NIDS that cannot be had by simply improving the efficiency of existing ID systems? And I beg you keep your answer short. I'm trying to get to one more question.
Okay. So one of the benefits, well, firstly, those systems, they are excluding persons who need identifications, right? And because of the purpose of those identifications, which for the passport, that is to travel, driver's license, it is to make you legal on the road. And for the electoral ID, that is to allow you to vote. Based on how it is made up, the purpose of it, there are certain benefits. For example, the digitization, accessing digital services. None of those identifications allow you to access safely and reliably access digital services. For example, if the government should implement the electronic government services, because you're not able to obtain a digital identification from those identifications that are here.
Okay, I guess that summarizes it. So, given one listener wants to know, Grace Lindo is asking, given the NIDS judgment, we likely cannot coerce Jamaicans to get the ID.
Yes.
So, what are the ways in which we can nudge them to do so? And nudge means to do so in a way that is not coercive. And I think, Roger, you'll be the best person to answer this question.
Certainly. Thank you for that question, Grace. So it's a very important thing to recognize that as a matter of law moving forward, our system will need to be totally voluntary. And that's a good thing, because people need to maintain their freedom of choice and dignity. And there are people who don't want to enroll in how that it was proposed at that time. So the first way is that the government can simply demonstrate, if it believes that there are strong benefits to this type of enrollment that don't have serious risks, demonstrate that they're providing the option and incentivizing persons to enroll in ways that are meaningful to them. So for example, it may, just by doing it, someone may find that they don't need to travel down to some place in order to use a service, and therefore, because they have seen it work for other persons, they may choose to use it. So the results should attract people as opposed to push people into using it. But it's also the flip side. We also shouldn't artificially create difficult circumstances for persons that therefore require them to use it. So for example, as we've seen in other countries, including actually in India, which was cited, and it led to more exclusion, where the government said, we want you to use this ID, so we're going to now make certain services artificially contingent upon the use of that ID and do away with other forms of legal identification that were working for you before, so we can, quote unquote, nudge you into using the ID. What that means is that it's really a soft form of coercion that says we can't make you a criminal for not enrolling, but we're going to make it difficult for you to access services, so we make you enroll. That's not what we want, and I don't think that will build consensus. And so one of the things that's really important here is that we recognize that there is a public-private sector role to play here, because if that happens in both the private and public sector, you know, you can't go to the bank without having the NIDS, or you can't do certain things, and persons will really be coerced indirectly into accessing this and into enrollment, which is not the foundation that you would want to build any such system on. But moreover, it does also, as we saw in India, recent research that came out from their ADHAR program found that after persons were coerced effectively into using the system, transactional rates actually went up because persons started to, and the black market, so to speak, for services increased. And there was greater levels of social exclusion and lower uptake of services when vulnerable groups were used as basically the guinea pigs. So it would be, for example, an example that Respectfully is in Monique's report is about using PASS beneficiaries, basically the first testing ground. That's fine to offer the option, but it can't go to the point of, for example, saying you can't access PASS unless you have enrolled in something that the Supreme Court said should be voluntary. We've seen elsewhere that actually increases exclusion, and it really isn't a humane and dignified way to approach a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. We'll have to leave it here because we're out of time, but I think we've addressed some pretty important questions. And in particular, we have, I think, got an appreciation that despite the enormous benefits to be had from a national digital identification system based on biometrics, and particularly the benefits to the citizenry themselves, that there are still a lot of tricky issues to navigate, issues in terms of privacy and compulsion, and in particular, what is the way in which this is going to be managed, executed, and managed. The report is available on our website, capricaribbean.org. So you can go and download it and look at the issues discussed in the report, which is a more fulsome presentation of the issues than we were able to do in a presentation. I turn it over now to our host, Leanne Levers, to take us out.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I just want to thank you for your participation, for your questions. I particularly want to extend thanks to our corporate sponsors who consistently support our endeavors to inform evidence-based policymaking. As you'll see here on the screen, we have a range of sponsors who consistently support the work at CAPRI. I also want to thank our key presenter, Monique, and the rest of the panel who provided a very good way of not just the benefits of a national identification system, but bolstered that discussion by consideration of things like public awareness, independent management and oversight, some of the more technical elements as to how we can achieve a successful national identification system, and also the importance of human rights, which of course should be at the forefront of any development and implementation of policy, particularly around freedom of choice, data protection, and privacy. I just want to also reiterate what Damien said in terms of going to the CAPRICaribbean.org to read the full report, which provides a series of recommendations as to implementation and development of the national identification system within a Jamaican context. And also just to give awareness to our Slido poll results, which should pop up on the screen shortly. There we go. So yes, 93% of our participants found that this presentation gave them a better understanding of NIDS. And so that's great news. And we're glad to hear that. If there are any other questions that people might have after having read the report at CAPRICaribbean.org, please let us know. Please email us at info@CAPRICaribbean.org for further information. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your support.